Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price but stay for the service.
And we are back, and we're jumping right into our first conversation. We are going to be speaking all about the events that are unfolding in the USA right now in the wake of several protests which are springing up all over the country. And joining us to give his perspective of the current events and sharing a bit of his experience is a very familiar face. Of course, we have journalist Kendis Gibson. Good morning, Kendis.
Good morning, you guys. Good morning, Belize.
So, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I've been in New York nearly 30 years now, and it's the first time that we've ever been under a stay-at-home order and under curfew. It's been very, very surreal. Like, the streets are fairly clear. Yeah. The curfew is from 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. till 5 a.m. in the morning. And as if the city wasn't clear enough last week, now it's, for the most part, just dead.
Yeah. So we actually have curfews as well. The biggest difference would be you have two different purposes for your stay at home and also your curfew. Kendis, let's take a moment to reflect on the series of events over the past week. And looking at where we are, where you guys are today.
Yeah. Okay, so just the last week, you know, you had the kneeling death or murder of George Floyd that took place on Monday of last week. The video came out pretty early right after that. It was like a 13-year-old girl who was videotaping it. So I remember waking up Tuesday morning to it, and there was something that was different about that video. It was just, you were watching a live execution for 8 minutes and 45 seconds. And that was a weird thing about it. And then it just came on the heels of, you had that white woman here in Central Park who did some great acting job, where she claimed as if she was being threatened by a black man, and she called the cops on that black man. And that's how it happens in America, where you get one of those calls like that, the cops come looking for a black man, and boom, just like that, you end up where you're being needled to death. And it's happened so many times. And so that really just triggered the week of protests. With Minneapolis getting started, the officials there in Minneapolis did a terrible job of trying to quell everything. The U.S. attorney that's in charge for that area held a press conference where she was like, "Don't worry, I've spoken to Bill Barr and President Trump, and they're gonna do justice." Well, that's the last thing you want to say, because Bill Barr and President Trump aren't necessarily known for doing anything as far as justice goes. And it's just really moved quickly. In the last week, there have been protests all over the country. There have been riots all over, and the riots have calmed down, the protests have ramped up, and it's become a little bit calm. And the story has just evolved, even though as the arrests have continued, you know, the president has ramped things up by gassing his own people who are peaceful protesters on Monday, and while doing this very V for Vendetta type speech, just so that he could do a photo op. It has been crazy. I'll tell you the difference though with these protests or these riots, because I've been here for many riots. I was here for Crown Heights riots. I was in Ferguson myself for the riots there after the police shooting of Michael Brown. Back then they rioted their own neighborhood, and so they needed to rebuild their own neighborhood. The people here are taking, they're raiding and looting Gucci. They're raiding Target. They are raiding Fifth Avenue stores, Beverly Hills. At least they're smart enough to riot their own neighborhood.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, you know, and I think that's where a lot of the critics have been sounding in, looking at the riot, at how some of the peaceful protests turned into riots and looting. And clearly that has created another rift in terms of how it's covered, whether there's too much attention being paid to rioting and looting, and even attempts to be able to differentiate that there are persons who are deliberately going into the protests to participate in these types of acts. Where do you weigh in on this?
I mean, I do think that there are some people who are taking advantage of it and infiltrating some of the protests, but the vast majority of the people are just sick and tired of being sick and tired. And then the president's speech on Monday not only made people tired, it made people angry and scared as for what's to come. It gave them a preview that you have this person with dictatorial tendencies now who could raid down innocent people because he's got the government behind him, or he's got the military behind him. So it really has evolved all over the place. As far as my thoughts on the riots, how are people supposed to protest? You know, they yell at Colin Kaepernick for kneeling. They told Rosa Parks way back when that sitting down on the bus is a wrong way to riot. Even when MLK was marching, they told him not to riot that way. And this country was founded by riots, as you probably know by now, with the Boston Tea Party that started this country. The Revolutionary War was a riot. Stonewall, that started the modern day LGBTQ movement that's had success, was a 5-day riot here in New York. So it works in some ways. And, you know, what else? I don't know. People are just tired. It just keeps going if you're just protesting.
Yeah, and do you, and also in, you know, sort of in the coverage of these events, you know, people, as Marlene said, will focus perhaps on, you know, some of the violence and the looting or what have you. But one of the things that hasn't been so apparent in you know, much of the coverage in this is, or I should ask the question is that, is there much of a focus, or is there a particular goal or goals that are clearly being perhaps articulated, or that is there a clear goal behind these things that you know, we see as they grow across the country?
A clear goal behind the riots?
Well, the protests, you know, or yeah.
Protests, they would like, there's no like, we're lacking a little bit of leadership, at least from the protest standpoint. So there's no clear goal that's been laid out there. I've heard different things about police reform. You know, this government, the U.S. government has initiated some prison reform. So there's been talk about, hey, why don't we come up with some measures for police reform? Kamala Harris, who's going to be our VP candidate probably, has pushed for some stuff along those lines. There's no real clear
objective.
Yeah.
It's just basically stop killing Negroes.
Yes.
Like, stop killing Black people, please. Yeah. That's like one start.
Yeah, I think Gavin's question is a critical one, because as outsiders looking in, we definitely can understand the pain and the rage that fuels the protests. And it's massive. It's across the United States, now across the globe. But the biggest question is, you know, these types of protests come to an end when there is some kind of substantive action being taken. Yesterday, we saw the remaining police officers being charged, and the upgrading of the charge of Officer Chauvin. So it's a part of what was the call that was being made in the past week. But clearly, since the protests haven't ended, it's not the end goal. Where do you think this will end?
It isn't the end goal, because we've been there before. Rodney King, the officers of Rodney King were charged. They moved the trial out of town and to a white area, and they were not convicted. There was a shooting here in New York City. I forget his name, but he got shot 41 times, this guy, unarmed guy, in his own hallway. An African immigrant. I get, and this will tell you how screwed up the world is. I get Amadou confused because one of them was sodomized by cops. Yes. And do you remember that at a police station? and
Yes.
the other one was 41 shots. So, and there were 4 cops that were wanted with that, and they ended up moving his trial out of town. Okay, you're right. So Amadou Diallo was the 41 shots.
Yeah.
Yeah, they moved his trial about 2 hours north of here and to a white area, and those cops were not convicted at all. So we know how this is going to play out. They're going to push for this trial to be moved out of Minneapolis, even though Minneapolis is very white. It's 96% white, 93% white, but just to get in a different jury, probably out of state, and then it's going to be tough to convict.
So what you're saying is experience in history has taught Americans that essentially just because the police officers are arrested, it doesn't mean that justice is served.
Yeah, exactly. We've seen this movie.
Multiple times. Yeah.
We've seen this movie, and they end up walking. The guy who previously choked Eric Garner here in New York City, the first person that said, "I can't breathe," he's still walking.
Yeah. Do you think that the circumstances of the time and also what had been frequent reports of what were just unjustified violent actions being taken against Black Americans kind of just led to this tipping point? I mean, people were at home, they were frustrated, they're losing jobs, they're losing loved ones from COVID-19, and then they hear all these reports about, the Amy Cooper incident that took place right before, Breonna Taylor, and I mean, they can go so far back with all the stories. But there seemed to have been a concentration of headline stories around this matter right before George Floyd was killed.
Exactly. It was the Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. Yes. It was a culmination of all of that. Like, people have been cooped up, and they were expecting to be cooped up and then be let free and go to the beach. They didn't expect to be cooped up and have a right to protest. And so that's in essence what ended up taking place. Yeah. Well, you have your Tito appearance somewhere back there. Something got riled up. Oh my God.
Tito is upset too, it seems.
He's fairly white, but he's got our back.
So let me personalize this for a moment. Candice, when you woke up and you saw that video, what went through your mind? What did you feel?
I was just like, how does this shit happen again, is what I said on my Facebook. I'm like, how does this happen again? And I watched it several times. In the days that have gone along, I've asked our people at MSNBC, personally asked them to not run the video anymore. I feel as if we needed to watch it a couple of times, but and get the point across. But as the days have gone on, it's become a little bit. It's and I know you're playing it. It's a little bit of violent porn, and we forget a lot of times that that's somebody's father, brother, cousin, and we know what happened, several days into it. So I've asked our people to stop running it, but I watched it a few times, and I'm just like, ugh.
Was there a moment in the video that really affected you?
There's a moment when his eyes almost kind of like pop, and you're like, that's when all of life is going from him. Yeah. Or when he calls for his mom who had been dead 2 years ago this week. That he was just crying out for help, and they didn't help him at all. What did you guys think of it when you saw it?
You're such an interviewer. I'm affected by multiple things. I think one, definitely that moment with his mother, just, grown men reaching the point of such a grown man reaching the point of such helplessness, that he resorts to calling out to his dead mother. I mean, we didn't know at the time she was dead, for help. I thought that was just, heart-wrenching. And I really feel for the people who were videoing. Yeah. I thought that sense of helplessness
Yeah.
Because they were begging for help.
Yeah.
They were begging them to stop. And you saw one young man attempt to move forward. And clearly, the fear that they had for law enforcement was evident by the fact that they didn't just get in there and try to get him off. Because that's a human instinct, to save a life that you see that is leaving this earth right in front of your face.
And they're going to live with that psychologically of like, oh, couldn't I have done
and
something?
That's also a form of not just trauma, but that was also, I think, an assault on their dignity as well, that they couldn't do anything.
Yep.
Yeah. So
it was heart-wrenching, but it's not the only one.
Yeah.
You know, just because you saw it close up. The one in Georgia, the Ahmaud Arbery shooting, is just egregious. He went out for a jog.
So let me just dive a bit deeper here in terms of looking at the issue of racism. You know, you spent part of your childhood in Belize, and then you relocated to America, and you know, our experience very often when we travel to the United States is usually in big cities. We're with families, so we're already in mixed communities, and so maybe we haven't felt, or at least, you know, the level of racism as to what it's like when you're growing up there. What is it like for you being a black man in America?
You know, I don't get a sense of direct racism towards me that I've seen to my face. I've seen it happen to other people, seen it happen to coworkers. So I'm sure it happens to me. But I've seen it happen to a lot of my friends, and friends have told me while we were traveling that it has occurred to me as well, my white friends. But it hasn't been one of those things that has been top of mind. I see it all around. I know it exists, and you know, race exists, and I'm an equal opportunity racist. But I just, it hasn't really, that I know of, impacted me to any degree. But I'm sure.
And you know, but what you're saying about what you've observed, and sort of the larger conversation about racism in America, you know. Earlier, you were talking about, when we were speaking about the other instances where perhaps officers had been arrested and there had been trials, and you know whoever made the decision to move them to, you know, the white areas and something. It really speaks to the larger issue of institutional structural racism that, you know, sort of is all around in the operation of the way things work in the States. So I'm wondering if even, you know, as you observed that, and as you observed, you know, perhaps your friends and or people close to you experience racism, whether that sort of shaped the way that you know, went about, or even that you go about your life in certain ways. Like, is it something that you're always conscious of, or in the back of your mind?
Oh, completely. I'm very, 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 very well aware of it, and I look at everything with like a suspect eye, because I just know how this country is, and I know how they be. So I know how some people can be. So yeah, no, absolutely. I'm always always suspicious of actions, and I might have gotten a no to something or a yes to something as opposed to somebody else. And that wasn't necessarily something that you felt in Belize. I'm sure there was a huge level of racism down there, directed at different, I mean, Belize is such a diverse country, so it was directed at many different cultures. But here, it's just so amazing that it's still a black and white thing. Like the Latinos get in trouble, but at the end of the day, it still comes down to white people, whites and blacks, and whites still trying to take back this country for so many years for people. I mean, make no doubt about it. When Trump walked over to that church the other day and moved out all those people with the Black Lives Matter protests that were protesting peacefully, and stood there with 4 white men and that white woman, and the only contingent that walked across from the White House were all white people and 1 black security officer. That was a white power flex. That was like, listen, we know you're rioting and protesting because Black Lives Matter, but here's who really has the power in this country.
Here's the power.
Just so you know.
And also hold the Bible.
And hold the Bible upside down. We're reclaiming it for our country. But that's what people have done over the years in this country. Use the Bible as an excuse, or the KKK used it as an excuse to kill a whole lot of blacks, and slavery, and it was used all throughout the time. Yeah. The optics of that were very clear.
Yeah, and in addition to that, which was really, I think, as a really sort of horrible picture to paint, to make matters worse, is that he actually threatened military aggression against the American people, which I don't know, can I get your reaction to that? Because I was really quite astounded. And that's because a few things that President Trump says can really astound me nowadays. Really? But that I think was really, almost unprecedented for an American president to say.
Yeah, it was the scariest thing that I've seen. I kept calling people and telling them, you have to watch the TV right now. We've gotten tired of watching him on TV and listening to his speech, but what took place there was, from a marketing standpoint, a stroke of genius. But it was also the most scariest thing that you could imagine. He timed it perfectly for the protesters to take out everybody as he was speaking. It was even in his teleprompter speech. And then his plan to pull in the military onto the streets of the US. It completes a dictator's playbook. And there's so many of us that think that that's where we're heading. And I'm pretty convinced that's where we're heading.
And it's important, Candice, that we put this into context. For non-Americans, what is the significance of the move of even suggesting that his next step would be to deploy the military on American soil?
Well, it's never, the last time it happened in 1992, but for you to pull the military onto American soil, onto US soil, the governors have to invite you to do it. It's rarely done. Back in the 1950s, when they wanted to integrate schools, the military did go in to march the National Guard and military did go in to march some black kids into the white schools. Exactly, to protect them. Yeah. It's been rarely used. 1992 was to control the riots in California, just because the governor there, who was Republican at the time, was having a hard time with it, but he asked for them to come in. What you have right now is there are very few governors who would allow the US military to move in to their states. Washington, D.C. is controlled by the federal government. So it's Washington, D.C. right now that he can just kind of push around right now by having the military in. The others, he's having a hard time controlling, but he's showing that he has powers and he's willing to do it. And that's the playbook that you would have from in Hong Kong that the Chinese are doing, or in Venezuela. And like, we've lost the right to say anything to those countries.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, because a lot of the time, America has its reputation as being sort of the world police, and they're always looking at and criticizing other countries. And now, I mean, as you said, Venezuela, that would have been one of my natural comparisons to make. And I'm actually curious about sort of, you had said that you were thinking that it's like a step towards dictatorship and it's where we're heading. And so what sort of has been the response of the government and the police and stuff, especially like in New York, for example, so far to the protests? Because we've seen some images come out both in the mainstream media and on social media of, increased police presence, militarized police. We've seen some videos of them still continue to, beat or some of the protesters, and there have been people injured so far. So I'm wondering how have you been reacting to the government and the police's reaction to all of these events?
Well, I think the protests have kind of calmed down a little bit, and even here in New York, they've allowed it to be a little bit more calm. The folks that were rioting and looting from a couple of nights ago, they're either locked up in jail or not infiltrating the protests as much as possible. Yeah. So they've come to a happy medium. We have this curfew that starts at 8 p.m., but the police are still kind of letting them go for the most part and tiring them out, and letting people just march as long as they stay peacefully. And I think that's all we wanted. Just things just kind of sparked a few days ago where they just wanted to burn stuff up.
So what are your thoughts on the sustainability of the protests? Right now, some people aren't working, so they're able to be out on the streets. At some point in time, they'll have other obligations that may take them away. How long do you think this can go for?
I would imagine maybe a couple more weeks. When we had that Occupy movement, Occupy DC, Occupy Wall Street, that went on for 3 months from my memory. I'd say it'll go on for a couple more weeks and the numbers will get smaller. Maybe there'll be a big one this weekend that'll be the culmination of everything. Yeah. But then it'll die down. But all those people are hopefully going to remember in November the same feeling that they feel right now and be able to coalesce it into voting. And when they have to wait on lines for hours to vote, because there are few polling places that they'll remember it.
So when you look at how this has impacted the rest of the world, there have been protests just on every other continent in solidarity. And even if you look within the United States at the diversity of the protesters, what do you think about that?
It's great. There are more white protesters out there than black folks. I've gotten so many apology texts from white people.
What do you mean apology texts?
Huh?
What do you mean apology texts?
It's like, hey, I just want to make sure you're okay. I'm like, I haven't talked to you in a long time. Just want to make sure you're okay. It's like white people feeling guilty and feeling embarrassed for what's happening in the world that I've gotten so many of those. It's like, I just want you to know I love you and we're all hurting together. Stuff like that. Like, we haven't talked in forever. I'm with you. Always have been. Always.
You're actually reading the text.
Yeah.
No, but Candice, this makes it. Does this make it different? This response from multiple races coming together to stand up against racism?
Makes this particular incident
different? Protest different. Yeah.
I mean, I feel as if there's always been a little bit of solidarity. There were a lot of white folks who helped protest in the 60s with many black folks here in this country. But this here is different in the sense that it's one giant march for race. And so everybody is coming together. We had massive women's marches after Trump went into office. We had massive marches about all different issues, climate change, and a number of different issues. Yeah. This kind of cuts across every race and brings everybody together on all of those issues. Women are just as upset and impacted by all of this. If you're an environmentalist, you kind of hate Trump. It brings together all of those movements from all over the years.
Yeah, and do you then think that this is sort of a big or a boost in momentum, since you mentioned November, behind people who are against the things that Trump seems to stand for, and does it make you sort of hopeful that perhaps he may not be president again after November of this year?
I mean, after November 8th, 2016, I don't think that any Democrat could have any hope. There was a study that just came out that showed that 33% of Republicans are hopeful for November victory, and 17% of Democrats, I think the number was, are hopeful for November victory. This despite all the polls that show that Joe Biden's in the lead, and all the momentum that Democrats have in a lot of red states. They just don't want to be surprised like they were the last presidential election, and they know that a whole lot of crap can happen between now and then. So even though we're seeing this movement, the election's a lifetime away.
That's right.
Yeah. You think about it, the start of the pandemic was only 2.5 months ago. And look at what we've gone through in that time.
There is so much time between now and November, especially for the United States.
Yeah, exactly. So while it gives a lot of people hope, and because people are angry and sick and tired, but hopefully they can have that feeling in the 3 months to come.
Now, the critics to the protest, or I guess the opposers to the protest, all chime in under the All Lives Matter movement. I'm sure you've encountered them. You probably have people that you know who say that to you. What's your response?
I mean, I think those are people who just basically don't get it, and they don't understand what exactly is happening, and what a deficit that most Black Americans start out as in this country, and how you are seen completely differently. Like this police officer in Minneapolis, he used to moonlight at a club nearby, and the owner of the club would say there's just like a different take that he would have when there's African American night versus their normal Latino night, where he would just get more officers because he's worried, and he would just get completely prepared in a different sort of stance. So you're just seen more as a threat when it comes to being a Black person in this country. And so it's not necessarily, so when people are going about and just saying like all lives matter, it's like, you just don't get it, basically, is what my take is. Yeah. You don't understand what. Do
you feel compelled to correct them, to help to educate them?
Oh yeah, like I have no problem in telling people my thoughts on all of this. Yeah. It doesn't matter if it's white in-laws or such, or friends that I'll lose. I don't really care. Yeah. It's too important. So if at risk of losing some friendships, then yeah, I'm okay with that.
Now, I mean, and I like that you said that, because you're here clearly sharing your opinion, but you're a journalist, and it's a tough time, I'd imagine, because you do have to somewhat separate yourself when you're talking or reporting on the protests. What we have seen as well in the past week is where law enforcement have had no problem shutting down reporters in the middle of their work, shooting them with, whether it's rubber bullets, tear gas, pepper balls. Isn't it concerning for you that this is taking place within the protests?
I mean, we as journalists for the longest thought that we had our D badge was a giant shield. But the thing is that arrest last week of that CNN reporter is a good reminder to many, many Black reporters who are out there to realize you're still at the core, you're still a Black person. That is still how you're seen in this world. So don't think as if that press ID is your get out of jail free card. No, you still need the Jeff Zuckers of the world, your boss, to free you. I have felt like journalists have been a target for quite some time. Yes. And not just in the sense of like where you had the riots or this sort of thing. Yeah. The rhetoric coming from our politicians, some of our politicians, yes. Where you're saying these bastards and stuff like that, that gets penetrated into your brain and into the police brain and into the brain of the guys who are are on the street and they're drunk and they see a reporter and they'll go up to the female reporter and grab her and tell her to FHRTP. I don't know if you know the term. We have been under attack for quite some time. This has just made it a little bit more on display, and there are more cameras that are surrounding it.
I think definitely the press in the United States have enjoyed what was kind of a respect for the profession that has definitely been diminishing over the past few years. And I think we see that in the protests, in the covering of the protests, and it's actually very similar to what's happened in the case of George Floyd. It's happening on camera where people can see it.
Exactly.
But how does that change, or does it change how you report or your approach to reporting? I mean, there's this blanket all media statement. There's very little differentiation between what's an opinion in terms of the public consumption, differentiating whether it's news or opinion or kind of a talk show where you're sharing opinions versus just factual reports. How does this impact how you report?
I think there are certain things, and I've said it when I've spoken in Belize to some of your colleagues, I feel as if there are certain issues where there aren't two sides to an issue. And if you're out there and you are seeing what you're seeing in front of your eyes, maybe like in the case of what happened on Monday in front of the White House, and then 2 days later the White House came out and said, no, we didn't gas or pepper spray people, and we had some people who were throwing bottles. That's what happened, and that's the narrative that they came out with, and got that from official sources. And journalists then are on the other side of that issue, but they know what they saw. They saw what they saw. They have to come right out and say, no, they're lying, which is hard to say about your government. They're lying.
Yeah.
This is what I saw. And we're not supposed to necessarily go to protests and things like that, but I feel as if something like this, you're compelled to protest. It goes beyond just your journalistic job, but it becomes more about your livelihood as well.
And that also brings up an important point when you were speaking about there not being two sides, and the line that's going out, and that's the important topic of to quote again President Trump, to talk about fake news. We know that of course it's been increasingly difficult to combat false or misleading reports. Things go viral on social media now, and of course we've got different messages that are trying to be sent at all different times, so it can be difficult. And especially in the wake of the pandemic, where conspiracy theories were flying around, and people are trying to disseminate misinformation to people. So I'm wondering, how that has been to navigate for you as a journalist, especially over the past few months in the wake of the pandemic, and now all of that's happening with protests and stuff going on around the country.
You mean all the misinformation that's been out there? Yeah. We have a fairly careful process in a standards process in vetting the different sort of information that's out there. It's a lot of what this has exposed is how easily misinformation can get out there. There was early on where the cop that killed Floyd, there was video of him behind Trump at one of his Minneapolis rallies. That was a fake photo. There was the photo that's going viral this week of Hitler holding the Bible the same way that Trump has held the Bible. That was fake. We've just had to find and take a look at different things with a more skeptical eye, because there's plenty of truth right around you everywhere. But we don't need to kind of make it even more weird. And there's a lot of misinformation that is out there. Whether or not there are Russian bots that are at work as yet, I don't know. It's a little early. There's also some stuff going around about the whole Blackout Tuesday and whether that was a Russian thing, because if you do Black Lives Matter and Blackout Tuesday as a hashtag, it would diminish any of the Black Lives Matter posts that were actually happening. I have no idea.
All right. I didn't realize all of that was going around behind with that. But you know, in summary, let's look forward. So the protests are ongoing. We don't know for how long. You know, you have the support of people from all over the world. They're getting out and doing the protests as well. But what do you think will actually be a turning point for America? Is it just leadership, or do you feel that there's going to have to be a paradigm shift in how people view races? I mean, the racism that exists today didn't start today. It's systemic, and I think sometimes people are even unaware of the biases that they possess. So what do you think will be the turning point?
I don't know that I'm that hopeful that there is a turning point in this. The country's so divided. It is divided on race, divided on religion, really. And let's say it's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris that get into office. He's going to do a commission on policing. Okay, how is that going to help the Amy Coopers of the world that have that innate racism within them? Or the guys in Georgia who are going to lynch and hunt down and police their neighborhood for a guy who's jogging. It is a tough thing because it's just embedded in the core of this country. So I don't know how that gets fixed at all. I can tell you this: another 4 years of Donald Trump, followed by another 4 to 8 years of his son or daughter in office, that's not going to be the sort of presidency that will bring the races together. It'll stoke the fires even more, almost very north-south-esque.
Very interesting.
But that was hopeful. That was it.
Yeah.
basically, get my island ready, get my house.
But let's bring it back to the other big issue. I mean, it's amazing to think that even for a week, the United States has stopped talking about COVID with all that you guys are battling there.
Like COVID went away.
It didn't.
It did not.
No.
It's still there.
Yeah.
There are some cases that are still on the rise in some parts of the states. Luckily, New York's numbers are down. But we're still fairly locked down. We can't go to a restaurant. We can't go to bars, gyms, as you can see. We can't go anywhere right now until at least another month and a half. Yeah. And so COVID is still out there getting people sick. And it will come back uglier, I think, in a few months.
So you know there's a debate in Belize about when to open or airport to allow travelers to come back in. And it was originally set for July 1st. I don't know how up to date you are, but I wanted to get your perspective because you do travel. And I know you've been coming back home more often. There is a financial crunch there in the United States, but clearly what we're experiencing is completely different. And you know, the divide is open the airport or don't because we can't handle COVID-19. Do you think, Americans will travel if there is the airport open for people to come to Belize?
I think it'll be a while before Americans are traveling again. And I think it'll be a while before they're vacation traveling again. I did like a test flight, first flight in months, last week or a week ago or 2 weeks ago. I went to Phoenix, Arizona. Normally would be a 5-hour trip, but the way the flights are right now, that ended up taking 8.5 hours. And you're stuck in your PPE with the mask the whole time. You look at everybody as if they have the COVID, and you have your gloves, you're forced to wipe down, there's no service. None of it is enjoyable. I got off that plane and I'm like, yeah, I don't need to fly anytime soon. And that says a lot for me because I like flying, but it's just not an enjoyable experience. And I thought like nowhere's worth me having to get flying on a plane like that. And I don't know that that's going to change going forward. We're still going to have the mask, still going to have to worry about being in a petri dish. It's just not an enjoyable experience at all. I would love for the tourists to come back to Belize, but I think it'll be a while.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that answers both the questions I was going to ask. So, but we do hope to have you back when the airport is open, because we always enjoy having conversations with you. And thank you for weighing in on what's happening there.
Well, good to see you. Good to see you guys.
All right. Do take care and stay safe.
The dog is not as impressed by this conversation.
All right. Thank you, Candice.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you. Yes. Bye.
And there you have it. Oh, bye, Tito.
Tito.
Bye. See you guys.
Oh, see, he could have taken over the conversation. All right, so there we had it. That was Candice Gibson, Belizean American, who is a journalist talking about what's happening with the protests and summarizing there a bit with the COVID situation. We do thank him for sharing his input. We're going to go ahead and take a break now. When we come back, we're going to be talking about an autism support group in Belize. So please stay tuned.
This COVID update was brought to you by Foltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.